Albert Camus is frequently described as an existentialist, yet throughout his life he resisted that label with quiet but firm insistence. This resistance was not a matter of personal rivalry or philosophical vanity. It was rooted in a deep disagreement about what it means to live honestly in a world that offers no ultimate meaning. Camus and the existentialists, especially Jean-Paul Sartre, began from the same starting point, the collapse of traditional metaphysical certainty. God, destiny, and cosmic purpose could no longer be assumed. The universe appeared indifferent, and human beings found themselves alone within it. But from this shared realization, they moved in very different directions. Existentialism, in its most influential form, argued that human beings must replace the lost structure of meaning with their own creative power. Sartre famously declared that existence precedes essence. There is no human nature, no predetermined purpose, no fixed identity given at birth. People exist first, and then define themselves through their choices. Meaning, in this view, is not discovered in the world. It is created by the individual. To live authentically is to take responsibility for this act of self-creation. This idea carried immense psychological and political weight. It meant that even in a meaningless universe, life could be meaningful because it was chosen. It promised dignity in a world without God. It turned freedom into a kind of moral heroism. Sartre and many of his followers believed that by committing oneself fully to projects, causes, and relationships, a person could transform the emptiness of existence into purpose. Camus understood the appeal of this idea, but he believed it was a dangerous misunderstanding of the human condition. To him, existentialism did not accept the absurd. It disguised it. The absurd, as Camus defined it, was not simply the absence of meaning. It was the tension between the human hunger for meaning and the world's refusal to provide it. That tension could not be resolved. It could only be lived. To claim that human beings can create meaning is, in Camus' view, already to escape the absurd. It is to replace the silence of the universe with a human invention. Where religion once placed God as the source of meaning, existentialism placed the self. But the structure remained the same. There was still something that made life worthwhile in an ultimate sense. For Camus, this was a form of philosophical denial. Camus did not believe that the absurd could be healed. It was not a wound to be closed. It was a condition to be endured. Human beings want their lives to make sense. The universe does not respond. That is the absurd. To invent meaning is to pretend that the universe has answered when it has not. This difference reveals itself most clearly in how each philosophy understands freedom. Sartre described human freedom as radical and almost absolute. Because there is no predetermined essence, a person is always responsible for what they become. Even refusing to choose is a choice. Even obeying authority is a decision. Nothing excuses you from responsibility. Camus believed this vision of freedom was both unrealistic and cruel. It ignored the weight of circumstance. People are born into poverty or privilege. They inherit diseases, histories, and social structures they did not choose. War, illness, and injustice shape lives in ways no amount of will can undo. To insist that people are always free to define themselves is to deny the reality of suffering. Camus had lived too close to suffering to accept this. He grew up in extreme poverty in colonial Algeria. He watched tuberculosis destroy bodies. He saw war reduce entire cities to rubble. These were not choices. They were conditions. Human beings could respond to them, but they could not escape them. Freedom, for Camus, was not the power to invent oneself from nothing. It was the capacity to remain lucid and dignified within limits. Existentialism, by contrast, risked turning misfortune into guilt. If you are always responsible for who you become, then a broken life becomes a moral failure. Camus refused this. He believed that dignity lies not in self-creation, but in endurance. People do not need to become something grand in order to matter. They need only to live. This disagreement had profound consequences for ethics. Sartre believed that because people create their own values, they must act as if their choices define what humanity should be. Every decision becomes a statement about human nature. This gives each act enormous moral weight. It also turns life into a constant performance before an imagined tribunal of history. Camus rejected this idea. He did not believe people were responsible for humanity. He believed they were responsible for one another. Moral responsibility for him began not with abstract ideals, but with concrete relationships. You are responsible for the person you harm, not for the destiny of the world. This distinction becomes especially important in politics. Sartre believed that commitment to a cause, especially a revolutionary one, could give life meaning. History, in this view, becomes a narrative of progress toward justice. Suffering in the present can be justified by the future it promises. Camus found this logic terrifying. He had seen how easily people become expendable when an idea is treated as sacred. When history is imagined as moving toward redemption, those who stand in the way become obstacles. Violence becomes necessary. Murder becomes meaningful. Camus insisted that no future, no matter how noble, could justify the destruction of a human life in the present. Existentialism, by turning commitment into the source of meaning, made it easier to excuse cruelty. When a cause gives your life value, anything that threatens that cause becomes an enemy. Absurdism refused this. It said that life has no final purpose, and that is precisely why it must not be sacrificed. When there is no higher meaning to appeal to, the only thing that remains is the reality of human existence. A philosophy that forgets this becomes dangerous. Camus did not want a world in which people were killed for ideas. He wanted a world in which ideas were measured by their effect on people. This is why Camus refused to call himself an existentialist. He believed that existentialism, despite its courage, could not resist the temptation to turn human will into a new absolute. It replaced God with the self. It replaced destiny with commitment. And in doing so, it reintroduced the very kind of meaning that had collapsed. Camus chose a harder path. He chose to live without appeal, without God, without destiny, without invented purpose. He chose to remain in the tension between human longing and cosmic silence. That tension was the absurd, and to live honestly, one had to stay inside it. Camus' rejection of existentialism deepens when we look at how each philosophy understands the idea of freedom. For Sartre, freedom is the defining feature of human existence. Because there is no God and no predetermined essence, people are not bound by any fixed nature. They are condemned to be free. Every action, every silence, every compromise is a choice. There is no escape from this responsibility. On the surface, this seems empowering. It places the human being at the center of their own life. But Camus saw something troubling beneath it. Sartre's vision of freedom treated the human being as if they were almost unlimited. It implied that no matter what happened, a person was always responsible for who they became. This turned freedom into a kind of omnipotence. Camus believed this was a lie. Human beings are not infinitely free. They are born into circumstances they did not choose. They inherit bodies that break, societies that oppress, and histories that constrain. A child born into poverty does not choose that poverty. A person struck by illness does not choose their disease. A soldier drafted into war does not choose the battlefield. These are facts of existence, not expressions of will. Existentialism acknowledged these facts, but it insisted that they never excuse a person from responsibility. Camus found this morally and psychologically unbearable. It meant that suffering became something you were guilty of. If your life was damaged, it was because you had failed to choose well enough. The world's cruelty became your fault. Camus had lived among people who were crushed by forces they did not control. He had watched illness hollow out bodies. He had seen colonial injustice strip people of dignity. To tell these people that they were still fully responsible for what they became was not empowering. It was cruel. Absurdism offers a different understanding of freedom. It does not deny that people choose, but it insists that choice happens inside limits. You can choose how to respond to your condition, but you cannot choose the condition itself. You can resist, endure, or collapse, but you cannot erase the reality of what has happened to you. This makes Camus' philosophy both harsher and more humane than existentialism. Harsher because it offers no fantasy of total control. More humane because it does not blame people for what they suffer. Camus believed that dignity does not come from self-creation. It comes from lucidity. To see your situation clearly and to refuse to lie about it is a form of strength. You do not need to turn your life into a project in order for it to matter. It matters because it exists. This difference in how freedom is understood leads to a deeper disagreement about what it means to live authentically. For existentialists, authenticity means fully owning your choices. You must act as if you are the author of your life. You must embrace your freedom, even when it terrifies you. Camus did not reject authenticity. He rejected the idea that authenticity required you to invent a purpose. For him, authenticity meant not pretending that your life has a meaning it does not. It meant refusing to cover over the absurd with stories about destiny, progress, or self-realization. Existentialism wants to turn life into a narrative of becoming. Absurdism treats life as a series of moments that do not add up to a final meaning. You are not becoming something ultimate, you are living. This changes how one experiences time. Existentialism often frames life as a project moving toward a goal. Absurdism sees time as a flow that leads only to death. This does not make life worthless, it makes it fragile. Every moment becomes precious, not because it leads somewhere, but because it will never return. Camus believed that existentialism could not tolerate this fragility. It needed life to be moving toward something. It needed a future in which meaning would be secured. Absurdism refuses that comfort. It stays with the present. This is why Camus spoke of living without appeal. To live without appeal is to stop asking for a final justification. It is to stop hoping that the future will make sense of the present. It is to accept that no court of history will render a verdict that redeems everything. Existentialism, by contrast, often appeals to the future. It believes that through commitment and action, history can be shaped into something meaningful. Camus saw this as another form of metaphysical hope. It postponed life in the name of what might come. Absurdism does not postpone. It insists that the only life that exists is the one being lived now. This is not nihilism. Camus did not believe that nothing mattered. He believed that nothing mattered in an absolute sense. But that very absence of absolutes makes human experience more serious. When nothing is guaranteed, every act of kindness, every moment of joy, every refusal of cruelty matters more, not less. Existentialism tried to rescue meaning by giving it a human author. Camus believed that meaning does not need an author to be experienced. It only needs a consciousness willing to stay awake. This is why Camus refused to join Sartre's philosophical camp. He did not want a philosophy that promised salvation through freedom. He wanted one that could face freedom's limits without despair. The deepest and most consequential disagreement between Camus and existentialism emerges when philosophy moves from the inner life to the political world. Sartre believed that freedom becomes real only when it is exercised through commitment to collective action. To choose a cause is to give one's life meaning. History, in this view, is the arena in which human freedom realizes itself. A person becomes authentic by throwing themselves into a struggle that transcends the individual. Camus watched this way of thinking lead to catastrophe. He had lived through the Second World War. He had seen what happens when ideas become sacred. He had watched people kill and be killed in the name of futures that never arrived. For Camus, existentialism's faith in historical purpose was not merely mistaken, it was morally dangerous. When a cause is treated as the source of meaning, anything that threatens that cause becomes an enemy. When history is imagined as moving toward justice, those who stand in its way become obstacles. Violence becomes not only acceptable but necessary. Murder becomes tragic but meaningful. Camus refused this logic completely. He believed that no idea, no matter how noble, could justify the deliberate destruction of a human life. A revolution that kills in the name of justice becomes another form of injustice. A movement that sacrifices people to history becomes another form of tyranny. Existentialism, by turning commitment into a moral absolute, made it easier to slide into this logic. If my project gives my life value, then the survival of that project becomes more important than anything else. People become tools, suffering becomes a cost. Camus insisted on limits. Even in revolt, there must be lines that cannot be crossed. Rebellion begins when a person says no to injustice, but it must also contain a yes to human life. When rebellion forgets this, it becomes indistinguishable from the oppression it opposes. This was not a theoretical disagreement. It defined Camus's life. When Camus published The Rebel, he argued that modern revolutions had inherited the structure of religious absolutism. God had been replaced by history. Salvation had been replaced by utopia. But the logic was the same. The present could be sacrificed to a promised future. Sartre and his circle attacked Camus for this. They accused him of refusing to commit, of standing on the sidelines while injustice continued. Camus replied that choosing a side that demands murder is not moral courage, it is moral surrender. For Camus, the problem was not that existentialists wanted justice, it was that they were willing to buy it with blood. Absurdism rejects this bargain, because it does not believe in ultimate meaning. It does not believe in ultimate ends. There is no future state of the world that makes everything worthwhile. There is only the present reality of human beings living and suffering. To kill in the name of a future that may never come is to betray that reality. This is why Camus believed absurdism was more ethical than existentialism. It places human life above ideas. It refuses to let abstraction outweigh flesh and blood. Existentialism, in its political form, risks turning people into symbols. They become representatives of classes, causes, or historical forces. Camus wanted to keep them human. He believed that philosophy must never forget the face of the person who suffers. This is also why Camus opposed terrorism as fiercely as he opposed oppression. He believed that violence, once justified by an idea, spreads without limit. A revolution that begins by killing its enemies will end by killing its own. Absurdism does not offer a blueprint for a perfect society. It offers something more modest and more demanding, a refusal to betray human dignity, even in the name of justice. Camus did not believe that the world could be saved. He believed that people could be saved from one another. Existentialism wanted to redeem history. Camus wanted to protect lives. The final and deepest reason Camus rejected existentialism lies in how each philosophy understands the meaning of being human. Existentialism tells people that they must become something. It asks them to define themselves through projects, commitments, and identities. A life, in this view, is something that must be shaped into a coherent story. You are what you make of yourself. Camus did not believe this was true. For Camus, human beings are not stories waiting to be written. They are fragile creatures thrown into a world that does not care. They are born, they suffer, they love, and they die. Nothing guarantees that these experiences will add up to a meaningful whole. Absurdism begins when a person stops trying to force them to. This is why Camus believed existentialism placed too much weight on the idea of self-creation. It demanded that people justify their lives. It turned existence into a task. It implied that if you failed to make your life meaningful, you had failed as a human being. Camus refused this burden. He believed that human dignity does not come from achieving a purpose. It comes from remaining faithful to experience, to feel the sun on your skin, to love someone knowing they will leave, to fight injustice without believing you will eliminate it, to push the stone without expecting the summit. This is the ethic of absurdism. Existentialism offers a kind of secular salvation. You are saved by your choices. You are redeemed by your commitment. Camus believed this simply replaced religious hope with human hope, and hope, for him, was the great enemy of lucidity. Hope always postpones life. It says, not now, but later. It asks you to endure the present for the sake of a future that may never arrive. Absurdism refuses postponement. It insists that life is happening now, and that is all you have. This does not make life empty. It makes it intense. When there is no final meaning, every moment stands on its own. A conversation matters because it happens. A kindness matters because it is given. A revolt matters because injustice exists. Nothing needs to be eternal to be real. Camus believed that existentialism could not fully accept this. It needed a narrative of becoming. It needed life to be moving toward something. Absurdism accepts that life is moving only toward death, and it finds freedom in that acceptance. This is why Camus's philosophy is often described as tragic, but it is not tragic in the sense of despair. It is tragic in the ancient sense. It recognizes limits. It does not try to overcome them. It lives within them. This is also why Camus refused to turn suffering into meaning. Existentialism, by framing life as a project, risks turning pain into a tool for self-construction. Camus believed this was a moral failure. Suffering does not exist to make you stronger. It exists because the world is indifferent. To pretend otherwise is to lie. Camus wanted a philosophy that could look at suffering without transforming it into a lesson. He wanted a way to be compassionate without being consoling. Absurdism gave him that. It said, the world does not make sense. People suffer, and yet we must live. This is where Camus found revolt, not the revolt of building a new meaning, but the revolt of refusing to be crushed by meaninglessness. To revolt is to say that even though the world offers no justice, you will not add to its injustice. Even though life has no purpose, you will not betray those who share it with you. Existentialism wants to turn revolt into a project. Absurdism keeps it as a stance. This is why Camus's Sisyphus is not a hero who conquers fate. He is a man who accepts it. He pushes the stone not because it leads somewhere, but because it is his stone. The struggle itself is enough. Existentialism would ask Sisyphus what he wants to become. Camus asks him how he lives. That is the difference. Camus rejected existentialism because it could not remain faithful to the absurd. It wanted to solve it. It wanted to give it meaning. Camus believed that the absurd must be lived without solution. He chose lucidity over hope, limits over absolutes, people over ideas. In a world without God, he did not turn humanity into a replacement deity. He kept it human, and in doing so, he left us with a philosophy that does not promise salvation, but does offer dignity.